We should be running. Oh, we caught two sneaking in.
All right. Okay. This may be a little technical if you're not used to it. We're trying to understand spiritual cosmology. And cosmology is about how things get done in the evolutionary creation. It has been stated that the primary cosmological form of expression is the cycle. So, what we're going to be doing is we're going to begin with very simple cycles and then end up with two very long ones. It is a creation in which we live, and a creation means something new. If there's not something new, it isn't a creation. When there is something new, there is a change with respect to what was before there was something new. So this means there's two states. You can call them the new and the old if you like, but those are two states of being, as simple as you can make it. Now, when there is a relationship of consciousness, especially if it's comparative between the new and the old, there is a recycling of consciousness. That's not the way we use recycle now, but it's a perfectly legitimate use of the English. So anyway, we can see this from this, that in any cycle, just by simple logic, there have to be two states of change, going to the new and referring back to the old. Doesn't matter what kind of cycle it is, whether it's a lemniscat or whether it's a regular circular cycle, it's all the same. Now we're going to look at a very simple cycle, and it's going to be the same one that we looked at last time. It is a metabolic cycle, but we're not going to get really deep into the organic chemistry or any of that, but we want to talk about some of the ideas. And I'm not taking this cycle because I know a lot about metabolism, because that's not true. I don't know a lot about metabolism. It is for several other reasons. And one of those reasons is because metabolic cycles are so basic and they're so fundamental, and they don't go into another dimension, so that each cycle is exactly like the one before it. And there isn't a slow progress like there is, for example, with the cycle of the seasons or something like that. Another reason is that, at least in form, but not in detail, metabolic cycles are very basic and they're very fundamental. They're simple. So they're simple and non-progressive, and so the change in time is negligible, or as minimal as it can be. This means that the metabolic cycles are flat, and they're easy to deal with. In terms of technicality, the metabolic cycles are not extremely simple. They're not like day follows night, follows day, follows night. Not quite that way. In reality, there are three different types of metabolism, each having its own cycle. There's carbohydrate metabolism, there is lipid metabolism, and there is protein metabolism. And the organic chemistry is not really simple either. Probably only one person in the room knows knows the organic chemistry of it. It's not kind of thing like you oxidize oxygen and get water. It's not that kind of simplicity. Now, to all three types of metabolism and metabolic cycles, there is one very simple, common cycle to all three of them, and it's called the Krebs cycle. Now, to present a detailed exposition of the Krebs cycle takes many years of study and lab work, which I don't have. But the basic idea is it is how food gets turned into usable energy in our bodies, or usable stuff for building our bodies. For the most part, the metabolic cycle deals with the breakdown of food. Now, sometimes if you're fasting or if you're starving, when a fast carries beyond the point where all the stores are used up, then it becomes starvation and you start eating your own organs, and the pancreas is the first one to go. And the last thing to go in starvation is the central nervous system and the heart. I think in cases of death by starvation, only 2% of the nervous system or the heart are gone. So they're pretty well preserved. So if you gotta sacrifice anything, sacrifice your pancreas. Funny way of looking at it, but it's called autolysis when you digest yourself. Lysis means digestion. But basically, you can only go so far with it. And no organism can live unto itself. It needs something beyond itself, something outside of itself. Meaning to say, all organisms have limitations, and they're not like perpetual motion machines that run on their own energy. This is something that is fundamental to any kind of ongoing creative activity. We do draw on ourselves, but we have to do something new. We have to take in new food, or we have to have some new kind of experience, or we don't continue on as creative spiritual beings. This is a very basic metaphysical principle which can be applied on many levels, but we're not going to go into that because it's too far to the side. Now, in terms of human biological existence, this means taking in food and digesting it. Currently, we can't take pure minerals. We can't eat stones because we don't have the evolutionary experience to do that. And in order to develop other facilities of higher states of evolution, we had to sacrifice that ability, which the plants still retain. The plants can take minerals, inorganic minerals, and bring them into biological chemicals, fix them, which humans can't do. We do use inorganic things in our body as ions, and so the electrolytes in our body, we can use salts and things like that for maintaining those kind of balances. But the attaching is done only by the vegetable kingdom. I'm not sure, but I don't think that we can consume something of a higher evolution than ourselves. Like, for example, I don't think that we can etherically chomp down on the body of an angel and take energy from it. We just don't have that power. We don't have that capacity. The basic idea that runs through the incorporation of food into us is that in order to make something our own, we have to overpower it. And that overpowering is partially chemical, but it is also a matter of consciousness. It is a principle that is called the law of assimilation. And it's operative on both the chemical and the etheric subdivision of the physical world. The Bible tells us that Jacob wrestled with an angel, but I don't think he was trying to eat the angel. And I don't think he was successful in overpowering it. By the law of assimilation, it is meant that the lower the evolutionary status based on evolutionary experience, the easier it is to overpower the product of an organism and make it part of our own body. Everything that is in the evolutionary creation is struggling. It's struggling to evolve, it's struggling to participate, it's struggling to serve. And every living thing then puts its stamp on the materials that it works with. That is to say, an organism changes the minerals or the stuff that it works on, and it puts its own stamp. It's very hard. I don't think you can deal with it with most materialistic chemistry. It's something very spiritual, though there is a material counterpart. So this is how matter is evolved. It is taken through various different states with varying degrees of consciousness, and those states change the life that is associated with matter. And this is where the where the stuff is modified. Following this, it's much easier to overpower and absorb and assimilate an algae than it would be to do that with chimpanzee flesh. The chimpanzee is pretty highly evolved. It's for that reason that I myself, my primary source of protein is spirulina. Very rich in protein, but easy to overpower and easy to keep overpowered. Now, some people might say, it could be argued, that, well, there's more of a challenge of a will in eating dog flesh or cow flesh or something like that. And you can't deny that. There is an act of will in overpowering it, but the will could be spent much better in other ways. I, for one, don't want to just sit there after a meal with something heavy in my stomach and putting my will to be overpowering things. There are all kinds of other arguments for vegetarian living, but just in terms of simplicity and ease and parsimony in terms of energy and self-application, it's much easier. But at any rate, we take food and we bring it into the GI tract and it is digested. And the digestion is a pretty complicated activity. And the digestion is also broken down in the same way into carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about metabolic cycles. With digestion, the digestion is not complete. It's broken down, and some things are not completely overpowered. I eat a lot of garlic, and I can eat the garlic, and it's digested, but still the odor of garlic comes through the pores of my skin. So, it's a partial digestion, even with the digestive system working as well as it can work. This is why herbalists recommend that if you're taking medicinal herbs that you gulp them down. Because when you gulp them down, you at least stop the digestion that comes orally, where you start breaking things down, chewing them or sipping them or something like that. When the food is digested as far as it's going to go, it gets absorbed into the blood, either usually through the villi or through the lacteals or something like that. And then the food is assimilated to its use. The word assimilation means similar. It's from the same root. So it goes to the place where it is similarly needed according to its character. For example, sugar is assimilated to the brain. You don't need proteins in the brain, the sugars go to the brain. And the lipids go to the heart. The heart is working all the time, and it needs high heat energy, which comes from the breakdown of lipids. It's when things get to the cellular level that metabolism really takes place. Metabolically, the metabolic action takes place in the mitochondria of the cells. It's interesting, just as a sidelight, that blood cells do not have mitochondria. And even though we talk about the warming and the heating of the blood, it isn't by metabolism that takes place, because there's no metabolism that takes place in the blood cells. All foods, whether it's carbohydrates or fats or proteins, is broken down into very simple amino acids. And some of these amino acids, part of the acetyl group, enter into the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is common to all three of them. They enter together with coenzymes, and various things take place in the cycle. So like the Krebs cycle is a chain reaction of one kind of acid producing another, producing another, producing another, and it comes all the way around to the beginning. Is that a pretty good description of it? Okay. He's a very advanced organic chemist, so he would know. In the process, various products are made that are needed for other things. For example, some of the amino acids are taken out and they go to the liver, where protein is synthesized. And there are various products that are waste. Like, for example, in the heat process, carbon dioxide is formed. It's an oxidation process, even going through all of those different acid states. And the carbon dioxide makes its way to the blood, and that's what goes out when we breathe out. And heat is released. Now, the activity of the Krebs cycle is not just breaking down. It is also building up. It is anabolic. It has a building activity. And so some things are synthesized or put together for other uses, enzymes, things like that. So this is a very, very simple, rough idea of what's taking place in the Krebs cycle. And it's something that's pretty delicate, but it's constant. It's pretty delicate because from one acid to change to another acid to change to another acid, there has to be all kinds of weak bonds. It's not something like sodium and chlorine getting together and forming sodium chloride. That's pretty hard to break apart. Now we're going to come back to that cycle in just a little bit, but I want to indulge. And I want to indulge in a long side trip that relates to this eventually. And it relates to Norse mythology, the way it comes about. In Norse mythology, in Asgard, which is the home of the Aesir, the 12 gods, is a hall that's called Valhall. Sometimes it's referred to as Valhalla. And Odin is the chief of the gods, and he and the other 11 feast. They all come across the rainbow bridge except for Thor, because the wheels on Thor's cart are magnetic and they throw off sparks. And so he has to go through, wade through the water in order to get to Valhalla. Humans who fight the good fight, who strive for the good and never give up as long as they live, when they die, they are taken to Valhalla. And in Valhalla, because they are of such a character, they are adopted by Odin. And so they share in the feast of the gods. What they eat in this feast is boar's flesh. I'll write the name. I'm not sure I know how to pronounce it. By the way, there are some lovely copies. This is all from the Elder Edda, from Norse mythology that they found in Iceland. And it's the last intact thing of Norse mythology. But the name of the boar is Sehrimnir. Sarimnir is the closest I can come to the pronunciation. I've heard it pronounced Scrimnir, but that is probably some kind of making it easy or something like that. And this boar's flesh has a peculiar quality about it. In the course of the meal, when they take the knife and they cut a slice of it off, it grows back. And the boar's flesh that grows back is better than what it replaced. Sort of like the wine in Cana. The replacement wine is better. Now, in mysticism of all varieties, boar's flesh has always been the symbol of divine wisdom. Buddha, who was a devout and dedicated vegetarian, was said to have died of eating too much pork. And the interpretation of that is he consumed divine wisdom of the type of which you cannot consume and remain human. Meaning to say, he was at the edge or beyond the human state. Now, Rudolf Steiner says that pigs put creative energy into flesh. And that's why they get big the way they get big. And it all has to do with the construction of the body. A pig's tail, relative to the size of the body, is very small. And it's spiral. Even the pig's penis is spiral. But that's another topic. We don't want to get into penis discussion or anything like that. The idea is that in living, we produce an energy. And that energy is associated with the genitalia and the sacrum in animals that have spines and in humans. And in humans, because we have waking self-consciousness, we can take that spinal fire and put it into creative activity, even just in thinking. And we take the fire and we use it creatively. But because animals do not have that same kind of self-consciousness, what happens with them is the energy has to go out through the tail. Who was it, the French writer, that says that the good God has put the smile of a dog in its tail? And this is where the expression of energy comes in. If the creative energy is sometimes expressed in other ways, like in horns and things like that, but pigs don't have any horns. Sometimes they have tusks, but not very much. And so with that little tiny tail, they don't have a tail enough of a shock absorber. And in effect, what happens is that the creative energy that they produce, it has no real outlet, and so it gets put more and more into flesh. You find this all over the world. And for example, in Hawaiian mythology, the same idea is there. Now, there's something important in this little fragment of the Norse mythology. And part of it is that we never give up. We always, the things that we're trying to do are darn near impossible. Even the simple ones, like being in control of every one of our thoughts and never losing concentration, that's not an easy thing to do. But we never give up. We're supposed to never lie, because the truth is that important to us. In this activity, I personally feel very blessed. All of my life, I have striven to live a better life. Probably I haven't striven hard enough, or my progress would have been greater. But in the intellectual part of the spiritual life, I have spent most of my time trying to understand what great spiritual teachers really mean. What happens with spiritual things is that they're so clear and they strike us intuitively that we get them, but we're getting only the surface. And we need to understand what these things really are. And I've tried to do that all of my life. And whatever I have found, I have shared. Even the speculations or the guesses I've shared. I try to make sure that it's clear. And I've realized in doing this that there's always more beneath the surface. But when you do this, it's like eating boar's flesh. When something comes to you and you can verify it, and when you share it, the more you share, the more that grows back, and the better it is. And in the course, we're at talk number 62, and that means we've had 5 years going on in this series, and I hope another 5 that I'm allowed that long to live yet. But in the course of this series of talks, the same thing has happened. Before this, we did a sub-series on cosmography, and we were studying the physical world, both the etheric subdivision and the chemical subdivision. And we noted that all of the ethers were polarized, and no explanation is given for that at all. But what happened was, it seemed, at least it seemed to me, that this was because of the cosmological location of the ethers. The ethers stand between the more inward spiritual worlds and the dense physical, the chemical part that is exclusively outward. And because of that inner-outer quality, there is a polarity. And each of the ethers brings something in from a higher spiritual world into the physical, each having its own specific thing. Now that seemed like a nice slice of boar's flesh at the time. We didn't go deeply into the functioning of the polarity of the ethers or anything like that, because that would have been too much. But by the time that I came to ponder this talk, the Krebs cycle, and the ionic activity and the bonds in all of the acids in the Krebs cycle, by that time the boar's flesh had regrown. But if you eat boar's flesh, it's humiliating. We have to be humbled, because if we aren't humbled and we try to approach divine wisdom egoistically, we will burn up from the spirit that comes into us. And so the way it was, I was proud. I was proud of having taken that slice of boar's flesh. If I hadn't been proud at that moment, I probably would have been able to go deeper then. So I had to be humiliated and say, you got proud and you didn't see the reality. And then in the humiliation, I realized that what I had said amounted to almost nothing. It gave no answers of the how and why polarity came into being. All I did was point out a cosmographical relationship. So if we're going to speak even glancingly as we are about organic chemistry and physiology, we need to understand a teensy bit more about polarity and its function in cosmological process. Now, I didn't have time to brush up on the organic chemistry course that I never had. So what I'm going to say is going to be very abstract, and it's going to be vague. And it's going to go much more into the realms of spirit and not so much into the realms of chemistry. Let's start with a general principle. All activities and processes in the evolutionary creation are live. Everything that's going on is alive. And the life is not just mechanical. The life has character. Max Heindel, for example, describes how in a thunderstorm there's a battle between the sylphs and the undines for the partially condensed water in which the undines win and bring the water back to the earth, back to the general pool of water. Goethe, when talking about the topic that we're talking about now, goes into it. And he says, in chemical reactions, there are literally wars between the atoms. He got this from his clairvoyance. And we're told things like in our digestion, the digestion is accomplished by the gnomes. I can just picture a little gnome spinning a wheel, and that wheel is the Krebs cycle, but it's something of that nature. Now, it is all very fine to hear these things, but it doesn't take us very deeply into the hows and the whys of polarity. Polarity is all about positivity and negativity. Now, the words positive and negative have two matching sets of definitions. When we say that someone is a positive person, we usually mean positive by attitude. That is, someone who is optimistic and confident and proactive and such like that. Correspondingly, when we say that someone is a negative person, we mean someone who is doubtful or pessimistic or dark or depressive or something like that. Now that's one set of definitions. The other set of definitions is usually used in mechanics. When two gears are meshing or trying to mesh, they are said to be positive when there is no slip. Now, if the cogs on one gear are smaller than the gaps on the other gear, when force is applied through the gear with the small cogs, there's going to be a little bit of space where it isn't applying energy. And that there is a slip and there is a loss of momentum. And that is said to be a negative conveyance of energy. The same is true. A gear is said to be positive if everything fits in such a way that at every turn of the gear, every meshing of the gear, there's no slip anywhere. Those are the two different meanings. To some extent, they overlap, but because people assume the first meaning, there's a lot of misunderstanding of occult and spiritual literature from the late 19th and early 20th century. When someone is said to be a negative clairvoyant, many people think that this is a negative, bad person because they're using the first definition of negative, but that's not what is meant. A negative clairvoyant is an uncontrolled clairvoyant. A sweep of emotion or something like that has control of the clairvoyance, and the spirit within does not have that control. Even a sorcerer can be a positive clairvoyant. What they may be doing is maybe a very dark, negative thing, but in terms of being able to control their vision, they are positive clairvoyants. Now, the two definitions or the two meanings are not completely separate from each other. There's some overlap. For example, a negative clairvoyant also often does not have control because they get carried away by things. Pessimism, and especially fear, produces an involuntary clairvoyance. An involuntary clairvoyance that is atavistic, that takes us back to an animal-like state. So, psychics are more prone to predict disaster than they are to predict good things and highly creative activity. And they're much more accurate in producing predictions about dire things happening in the world. They usually have some great negativity, some great fear. Gene Dixon, who at the time predicted Kennedy's death, had a very extreme fear, irrational fear about Russians. The positive attitude people are more likely to have good things happen to them because they are applying themselves, and they're applying themselves relentlessly. Now all we have to do is apply this understanding to atoms and to chemistry. Now, we have to talk about something that's exceedingly hard to understand and speak about. And what we were going to speak about could be called the creation of matter. It's part of a dual process that is represented by all of mysticism, the materialization of spirit and the spiritualization of matter. But before matter can be spiritualized, it has to be. And that's what we want to talk about now, which is about as fundamental as you can get. Now, when we think about a creation, a cosmic creation, we tend to think in terms of the macrocosm. We think of galaxies or of divine hierarchy spreading through enormous amount of space and things like that. It is true that in that macrocosmic direction is where we find divinity, and we find the source of divine conceptions. And the beings that hold those divine conceptions are behind the entire creation and the evolution through the creation. It's called the great work, the same great work that the alchemists talked about. But it's in the nitty-gritty, in the microcosm, where it's all carried out. Different branches of mysticism have different names for it. Theosophy has different names than anthroposophy, which has different names than Rosicrucian, but there's one thing that is common to all of them. It's a state, I can't even say it's a state. It is the source of both spirit and matter. Both are ultimately derived from it. It's a state, or it's a potential. It is what could be if it were realized. In the Rosicrucian CosmoConception, it is called the cosmic root substance, and it is said to be the negative pole of the divine spirit. So we can see right here that there is this connection, that they're both derived or deriving themselves from the same stuff. Now, from a material perspective, cosmic root substance is not really a substance. It's more like mathematical space. Loci, infinitely small, having only position completely contiguous, completely undefined, which means that the points themselves have to be defined before they can be used. From a spiritual perspective, cosmic root substance as a potential is the ultimate source and the ultimate challenge of the will to be. Because you've got to define it, because potential, it can be anything. You have to define it even if you're defining it as a point. Pure spirit is awake. It subsists in itself. It is succinct and complete in itself, except that it needs to create and it needs to share. And so it goes outside of itself. Not the way we go outside of ourselves for food. It goes outside of itself to give. And it has to go to cosmic root substance. Creation, as we said in the very opening sentence, is new. That's the very nature of creation, is novelty. Now, in the macrocosm, this means the projection of a divine creative scheme, a scheme of an evolutionary creation, a dream, and it projects this into the potential. But it's in the nitty-grit where it is accomplished. For some reason that I can't really understand yet, it's a few slices down the line, creation can't be totally macrocosmic in its accomplishment. Part of the reason is it's abstract. And in order to be realized, it has to go through a realization process in concrete. So it has to be carried out as microcosmically as possible. This gives meaning, of totally different meaning, to an old spiritual saw that goes, the mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. And part of the reason for all of this is sharing. Sharing with the divine creative beings who bring these things to be, all the way down to the most microscopic levels, all the way down to the gnomes who accomplish it. The new has to be brought into manifestation. And this is done on the most microcosmic level that the universal spirit is capable of in this work. It is described as selecting points in cosmic root substance. Now, because cosmic root substance, the points are infinitely small and contiguous, this means hollowing out space. And this is what all the ancients and what quite a few of the alchemists came to, that what is a substance or a something in space is hollowed out of space. We know this. The deeper we get into manifestation in the spirit, like in the life spirit, is referred to as Christ the rock, because life spirit is completely, how do you say it? It's seamless. It's unbroken. But the further you get into matter at the other end of the spectrum, the more space there is, like in the orbits of particles around the nucleus of an atom. Now, consciousness and the will to be are characteristics of the spirit, and they are continuously, contiguously present. Being, there's no gap in the consciousness of divine spirit. It is, and it doesn't stop ising. Now this carries through all of the states within it, right down to the differentiated points within cosmic root substance. The deeper, as we just said, the deeper we go into material manifestation, the more severe or the greater the hollowing is. It's almost as if the greater hollowing is for the provision of more spirit to surround the point in space. I don't know that, but it almost seems that way. There's a very great mysterium magnum in how the spirit accomplishes this. That is, how a point becomes a particle, a point being in potential, a particle being in actual. I don't have an answer for that. That's beyond my capacity to understand, at least now. I think it has something to do with all-out sacrifice, but can't say that on this level. When we talked about polarity and the physical plane, we talked about it in terms of physics. We spoke of their view being very different from those the view of mysticism, but what they're doing isn't unreal. It's just that it's a little bit awkward. We talked at that time about subatomic particles, and we said that there were two different types. Those that were without mass and those which had mass. Mass being important because it means affected by gravity. And this is something that all forms of mysticism have found, that everything in the physical world is subject to gravity. Even light is subject to gravity. Now, at the time that we talked about that, the Higgs boson hadn't been discovered, or it was theorized, and had been theorized for quite a long time, but it hadn't been discovered. So in those few years since we talked about it, it has been discovered. And something very, very interesting with regard to that happened in those years since then. On National Public Radio, I listened to a physicist who described how the Higgs boson makes mass. It was not a difficult description. And then I ran across an article, which I didn't bookmark, by a man who describes the production of matter from the Gnostics. And both descriptions were almost identical. It's just astounding how close they were to each other. They could have been done by the same person. Now, that doesn't prove anything. That could just be a coincidence. It seems awfully strange to consider that as a mere curiosity, and it certainly does give respect to the Gnostic mystics. As I understand it, the transformation of a point to a particle or a potential to an actuality isn't one time for all. It doesn't happen like once you've done it, it's done. Because the points that become particles are positively negative. I don't know how to say it any other way. They're negative in that they resist. And they resist without surcease. And the way they resist is by offering no resistance. If you make yourself stiff, you're fairly easy to carry. But if you offer no resistance and let your body puddle out, it's much harder to carry someone. And if you take that and that notion and take it to the ultimate, you have that the resistance is not an intentional resistance, it is just the nature because it hasn't been, in a manifest sense, it doesn't know manifestation, and to hold it into manifestation requires a constant application of will. It's utter impassivity. So the positive pole has the character of the spirit that never gives up, and it constantly applies itself. And the negative pole, the negativity of a polarity, comes about because there is the resistance by not offering resistance and being passively resistant. Now, there may be some kind of threshold in all of this, but the agents and the agencies that bring this about, this is what they have to deal with. Now, it's obviously much more complicated than this. The way I'm stating it, this is just a very simplistic point of view, because I'm basically a simplistic person. the particles, at least according to materialistic science, form what are called atoms. And you can go on the web and you can see pictures of atoms. You can actually even see a picture of an electron in action. And there is a scheme of evolution, the grand evolutionary scheme that takes place in the production of a solar system or a galaxy is in some form reproduced in the periodic table, and there's that kind of evolution. And with organic chemistry, there is another evolution, but it's a much more complicated one because the organic chemicals have been brought into the forms that they've been brought into by an etheric body, and that makes it all the more complicated. So there are all of these worlds of polarities. You know, it takes a long time in a lot of different states, with what I'm trying to say, to take a point and bring it all the way through and then eventually bring it to some kind of consciousness. And so these are the things that are behind those wars that Goethe spoke about. The wars between atoms. They aren't destructive wars. They are like plays in which all of the participants in the play it in earnest, play it for sincere. This is something that the Darwinians miss. They talk about the law of natural selection and due to the survival of the fittest, and that's all they see. They're seeing the outer part of it. If they only knew that there were divine group spirits that were leading one species against another for their evolution, for their experience. It's for earnest. If a cat takes the mouse dies, and that mouse, has learned a lesson, or the whole group spirit of the mice have brought it through all of that. Hopefully, we understand now a little bit more about polarity. And hopefully we can see that it is a very long and tedious process with all kinds of conditions and all kinds of repetitions of conditions and passing through them to be able to bring about the most elementary manifestation of the spiritualization of matter. It's important that we note in all of these tiny microscopic cyclical activities that they serve higher states. This is what might be called the law of service, because the universal spirit, in its creative generosity, gives the whole creative dream to be realized. Because of that, all of these, each particular particle, as it comes into being and its experience becomes spiritualized, that is shared with the same universal spirit. It's almost like having a teacher having a class of little children and all the children learning something and giving it back in a creative way to the teacher, and the teacher benefits by all of that. So the Krebs cycle is a very good place to begin the study of cycles for several reasons. It's simple. It's basic to metabolism. Everything reverts when we go through the digestion and the metabolization of food. Everything is brought down to the same level. We're not looking at some specialization. And it's simple in that it doesn't go into a lot of higher dimensions of time. And it has two states, and it has two activities, both building and unbuilding. These are all qualities of cycles, and we're trying to understand cosmological process by seeing it in action in different kinds of cycles. And this is a very good example of it. All of it is accomplished by loosely bound reactions. meaning to say that there has to be something of a lot of give. If something is fixed in a very elemental way, there is interaction, there is reaction, but it is not the same thing as when there are those delicate bonds that make possible all the wonders of organic chemistry that our bodies or the bodies of any living thing is. And it's constant. It's not something intermittent. It goes on every day of our life. Now, we're just about done. But in that constancy, there is a consideration that I don't have time to go into, but it is an ethical consideration. In the talk before this, we said that metabolism goes on until the spirit withdraws. We're not aware of it, but the spirit within us is metabolizing. Now, it should be obvious that the conscious part of our being is not the totality of our being. When we start self-conscious seeking for higher states of consciousness, we tend to think so much of volitional waking consciousness, and we tend to ignore the unconsciousness that we're not aware of, that's going on all the time. Whether we know it or not, the spirit is metabolizing. Now, we're prone to think that it's the waking consciousness that is all important. And it probably is more important, because that's more the direction of our future, becoming more and more totally awake, and being able in that awakeness to hold an attitude that has the whole metabolic and other unconscious activities follow after that positivity of awakening consciousness. I suppose eventually we could even control it right down to the smallest amount if we wanted to. But we can't disregard the unconscious. We may not be aware of all of the effects of when we do things that are not good for our body, but they happen anyway. We're unconscious of how certain foods or smoking or something like that, how it affects our body. We don't know all those details. It doesn't make any difference. It happens anyway. Now, the ethical question that I'm interested in is what happens in a coma or in suspended animation. I'm not talking about keeping somebody alive who is suffering on life support systems, but someone who is in a coma and may or may not come back to consciousness. What do we do? Where is the ethics? When do we give up? Because the spirit, in doing the metabolism, is evolving. Not the same way as we evolve when we figure out a math problem or if we write a poem or something like that, but there's an evolution going on. There is experience being gained. Do we hang on to life as long as we can? Or if we are responsible for someone else, do we hang on as long as we can? Or do we shut the system off? If the person is suffering and there's no possibility of coming back to life, that may be a different situation. But I don't have an answer to that. And that's the thing I hope everybody thinks on it and you give me some opinions along the way. But that's all we have for tonight. And next time we'll look at least at one more, maybe two more simple cycles. Any questions? because I won't answer a question once I turn the recorder off. Because too many people don't want to be on the recorder.